One of the solutions that's mentioned in the title of the speech, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, in his monumental work, the Ihya Ulumuddin, he completes the text, this voluminous work, with a chapter on self-evaluation, muhasaba and muraqaba, and then as a solution to the spiritual audit that he recommends that every person go through. He says that in order to achieve balance, and this is a constant theme throughout Imam Ghazali's works, i'tidal, or like a spiritual equilibrium. He says he recommends that a person be willing to engage in mujahada, or struggles, voluntarily. Right? We have a lot of people who go through struggles, but they don't have a choice. So he says that if you recognize, like imagine that you had like a spiritual application on your phone, right? That you were analyzing your daily practices and you recognize that there was imbalance in your character, an imbalance in one of your traits. He says then it's necessary to rectify that imbalance through mujahada, meaning self-inflicted struggle. And that means sometimes like you fast, even though it's not a necessity, it's not an obligation. Sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night to perform extra prayer and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help. Sometimes it's you take a journey, you separate yourself from the environment that's not conducive to your spiritual health. So he invites people to do mujahada. Mujahada means to struggle, to sacrifice. And then he admits that it's not easy to struggle and to sacrifice and to give up, your comfort. But if you recognize that it's a necessary element of your spiritual health, then he says what you should do to encourage yourself to struggle. Like, how do you encourage yourself to be a person willing to do mujahada? He says that you should read the stories of those who struggled in their lives. Right? Read the stories of the prophets. Read the stories of the companions of the prophets. Read the stories of the people of the past who are examples or ideals for us. And so I thought that maybe in this third session, because it's the third session and some of us might be tired, that it would be good to tell a story. Right? Fulfilling the request of Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi to tell stories and to read the stories of the people of the past, to derive lessons, not just to inspire ourselves, but to derive lessons as well. So in the Quran, there's a story that's referred to in brief in Surah Al-Buruj. قُتِلَ أَصْحَابُ الْأُخْدُودِ النَّارِ ذَاتِ الْوَقُودِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about a people that essentially were tested with the greatest trial, the ultimate sacrifice in life, and that was the trial of life and death. That a king essentially tested the people who believed in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by building a huge trench. And in that trench he built a raging fire. And he tested the citizens of his nation with the threat of life and death. And he said that if anyone believes that there is a God or a Rabb other than myself, then I will test him with death. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about that incident in brief. And then the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam elaborates on that incident. So in the Sahih Muslim, there is a long story or elaboration of that incident and the background of what happened before this trench was built and before this pit of fire was built. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, Imam Muslim rahmatullah alayhi, he narrates this hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Ibn Ishaq in his Sirah, he gives a little more detail. So I'm going to add some of those details as well. And I think that subhanAllah, this lesson or the story, it's full of incredible lessons about how to build up our stamina, our resilience, our patience and forbearance. So essentially the story begins with a man who we don't know his name, but was a hermit or a monk or a worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who followed the ways of what remained of Christianity, the teachings of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. And it's a really fascinating story, the details of which are in the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. It mentions that he would go from place to place as a laborer, and he would work during the day for a few hours as a mason, and then he would only work as much as he needed to eat for that day. And he would continue this process But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would test him. He hated fame, he had an aversion to fame, and yet wherever he went, people would discover him. So once he would become discovered, people would ask him, pray for my children or pray for my relative who's sick, and he would make a dua, he would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah would accept the dua, this person would be relieved of their difficulty, and then he would be discovered, and so he would move on. It's the complete opposite of the culture today, right? This is what we try to get likes in social media, we try to get favorites, we try to get fame. He ran away from it until he eventually settled in what is today Yemen. And at that time there was a king who Ibn Ishaq names as Dhu Nuwas, who was in the progeny of Jewish kings, but had essentially drifted away from the religion of Tawheed and monotheism, and had begun to believe essentially that he was the greatest power that existed, and he would not accept any Rabb except for himself. When you become so drunk with power and riches, right? This is what happens. All you can see is yourself. Even though in your tradition, in your culture, you believe in a God, but you won't accept that anybody has authority other than yourself. So he was so drunk with power that he essentially made it necessary for people to worship him instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to maintain his authority over the people, he used to employ sorcerers. There's like a black magic and then there's like illusion. There's like a reality to sihr. And so he had an elderly sorcerer who was becoming quite old in age. And so he recommended to the king, to Dhu Nuwas, that I'm coming to a point in my life where I will no longer be able to serve you. I fear that I will die. So I request that you send out a request to the people, to the citizens, an application for entry into this the university of the palace. This was like the Ivy League school of the time. That you find for me a good student who can learn the arts from me and then can carry on the service of the king. And so they sent out a request, and you can imagine that all the parents of the kingdom were thinking, my child, my child. So there was a young boy. Ibn Ishaq mentions that he may have been about 9 years old. They think his name was Abdullah. Allahu A'lam. But there was a young boy, and he was accepted essentially into this university. And he lived some distance from the palace. And so every day when he would go to the palace, he would actually have to pass through some wilderness and some, empty land, and then to towns, and then he would eventually get to the palace of the king, and he would learn, sihr or sorcery from the head magician of the palace or of the kingdom. So this is where the first test begins. Right? So obviously the point of this whole lecture is to speak about tests, right? Struggles and sacrifices. And how actually struggles make a person, can potentially, make a person a far better individual. I mean, that's the nature of this world, right? That's the nature of our civilization. One of the great mashayikh, he said that mujahada, struggle and sacrifice, is built into the civilizational code of Islam. If you look at all the stories of the Quran, the stories in the Hadith, you look at all of the, the models in Islamic civilization, they were people who struggled, they sacrificed. They went through great difficulty. In the month of Muharram, we talk about Ahlul Bayt and the struggles of Ahlul Bayt. Throughout the seerah, we see the struggles of the most beloved of mankind. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam reminds us, this is so fascinating, think about this, it's counterintuitive almost. The Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us that إِذَا أَحَبَّ اللَّهُ عَبْدًا ابْتَلَاهُ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a person, He tests him. وَمَنْ يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُصِبْ مِنْهُ. The one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for. If Allah wants good for you, He's going to test and afflict you. That's like something that doesn't make any sense to us, because our struggle is a pursuit of worldly happiness. That's the American dream. So it's like counterintuitive to think that you actually have to train yourself to be accustomed to difficulty, because that's what success lies in. For some of us, because we grew up in luxury, it's hard to imagine that. But if you ask someone who lives in the inner city, like a parent, especially like the African American community, how they raise their children differently from someone who lives like in the suburbs. How they teach their children that, don't assume that the police are going to necessarily, treat you like anybody else, make sure you have your hands on the wheel, right? They don't tell them that, well, we live in the land of the free and the brave, so therefore just, don't be smart about how you conduct yourself. Make sure that you don't reach into your pocket too quickly. Why? Because that's the reality we live in. There's a difficult reality we live in. If we care for our relatives, we warn them about those realities so that when that trauma comes, they're able to overcome them, right? They're able to face them correctly. Otherwise, a person in their innocence might think that, there's no bully. What are bullies? You don't tell your child that, if you get bullied, this is what you should do. If you don't teach them that, how are they going to survive? If you don't teach your child when they go to school that if someone touches you the wrong way, that this is a proper way of being, touched, and this is the improper way of being touched, then you make them susceptible to greater damage, right? So our deen teaches us that there's a positive element to struggles. So this boy, his first test is a very basic test. One day he's passing by, some villages on the way to school, right, the palace of the king, and he hears from a small hut, or the residence of this hermit, or this monk, the sound of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the dhikr of Allah. And obviously, the dhikr of Allah has this attractiveness. So he's immediately attracted to this, and he's thinking, what is this? Now obviously he has to go to school, he's late, he might get late, but he decides to take a detour. He walks into the gathering of this hermit, and he sits in the company of the worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he listens to the words of this rahib, of this hermit. And he's so taken aback. Just like many of us when we first listen to a really exciting lecture, right? We go to a conference and all of this stuff, this makes sense. This is amazing, right? So he's excited, he's inspired, and he decides that, he's going to continue to sit in the company of this rahib so that he may learn more about what he is inviting towards. And he does this every day then. When on the way back from school, on the way to school, calling it school, but essentially the palace of the king, he spends more and more time in the company of the rahib. Until a time comes when it becomes a distraction, and he becomes so late to school that he becomes reprimanded. He's physically reprimanded by his teacher. And then when he comes home, he's coming home late as well, so his parents physically reprimand him as well. They beat him. So he complains to the rahib. The boy says, imagine a 9-year-old boy, right? In some narrations, he's even younger than that. So he comes to the rahib and he says, look, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm attracted by what you say, but as a result of my sitting in your company, this is what's happening. I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. I go to work, I get punished, right? I go to school, I get punished. And I go home, I get punished. And this is one of the struggles that a lot of Muslims have to deal with in this country and outside the country. That you feel trapped. No matter where I go, if I turn to this direction, I find this difficulty. And I turn this direction, even my family, I find there's difficulty there as well. So the rahib comes up with a solution for him. He says that, look, essentially you're being delayed by one or the other as well. So say when you go to the palace that you were delayed because of chores at home, and when you go home, say that you were delayed because of, your studies at the palace. And so he relieves himself of that difficulty. Because essentially that's also what was happening. He was going late to one, so he was delayed at school, and so he was also delayed therefore at home. So this continues, and he begins, he continues his education with the rahib until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests him again. And that's the story of our lives, one test after the other. So he, alhamdulillah, he accepts the invitation of the remembrance of the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is intrigued and he's curious. But now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to test him in the strength of his conviction. So one day he's kind of passing by, he's walking along on the road, and he sees that there's a congregation of people, and they basically are making a fuss about something that's on the road. And so he looks further ahead and he sees that there's this giant dabba, there's this giant beast, right? Perhaps a beast, like a lion or something like that. And it's basically blocking the way, and people are really, concerned about this obstacle on the way. And so he decides to use this as an opportunity to test whether the knowledge that he had acquired from the sahir, the sorcerer, was superior to the knowledge that he had learned from the rahib. And so he says, he picks up a stone, and you can imagine if this is a giant beast, that you're not going to be able to kill the beast with a single stone. But he supplicates. He says, when he picks up that stone, that Allahumma in kana amru rahib ahabba ilayka min amri sahir faqtul hadhihi ad-dabba hatta yamdi an-nas. He says, "Oh Allah, if the affairs of the hermit, right, your worshipper, is more beloved to you than what I've learned from the sahir, then use this stone as a means of killing this beast." And so he flings that stone, he throws that stone, and it kills the beast. And obviously this happens in the presence of a large, group of people. So now he's tested again. So first of all, his first test was that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us to the truth, do we accept that invitation? Or do we kind of go with the flow and do what people want us to do? So he passed that test. The second test was, once you've accepted that call, a lot of young people, when they come towards the religion, they're tested because, mashallah, you're so young and you're so energetic, you could be doing anything, and mashallah, you came towards deen, we'll give you the khutbah next Friday at the masjid. Right? You're tested with fame. Why don't you lead the youth halaqah? So when these people see this miraculous event take place, immediately they flock around the boy and they say, "Oh young man, I have a sick relative at home, he's got this problem, she's got this problem, can you pray for them? Can you cure them of their sickness?" So he would simply say, "Innama la ashfi, innama yashfi Allah." I don't give shifa, I don't cure anyone. Allah is the one who cures. And so he would pray for the people, and they would be cured of their sicknesses. So eventually his fame begins to grow to such an extent that there was a jalis. A jalis is like a companion, a close companion of the king, who recently was afflicted with blindness. So he begins to hear the stories and the rumors of this young boy in the kingdom who has the power to heal, right? Who has this miraculous power. And he recognizes that he can no longer serve the king as a blind person, and so he hastily tries to find out news or find out information, contact information of this young boy. And somehow he gets to this young boy and he asks him, he says, "Look, I heard that you have the power to cure. Can you cure me of this sickness? Cure me of my blindness?" So again he says, "Inni la ashfi ahadan." I don't cure. Right? This is his test. Does he attribute this miraculous power to himself? Or does he attribute it to the original source, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so he says to this old man, he says, I don't cure. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cures. I can pray for you if you believe in Him. This is, subhanAllah, such an effective da'wah. Like physicians and therapists, when people come to you with sort of a need, but also sort of maybe not understanding what is the solution to their problems, you're like the front line of da'wah. Especially in this country, where there are people who come to you when they're vulnerable and they're curious and they want a solution. You can provide that solution so easily. Just say that, look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cures. Strengthen your faith, because that's part of the cure. Right? In any case, so the boy makes a dua for him. This man, he brings his faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He accepts the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The boy makes a dua for him. He supplicates for him, and he's cured of his sickness. The next day, this companion of the king, he comes to the court, and he's able to see. And the king's astonished. He says, "Who gave you back the power of sight?" He said, "Allah cured me." He says, "You have a Rabb other than myself? Who's this Lord that you speak of other than myself?" He says, "My Lord is Allah, and He is the one who gave me shifa. He is the one who cured me of this illness." Now obviously this infuriates the king. So Dhu Nawaz, he tortures his friend. I mean, this was his companion, right? This was one of his close ministers, advisors. And so he begins to torture him until he eventually gives up the name of the monk, and he gives up the name of the child. So this is now a greater test. SubhanAllah. So he's gone through at least 2 or 3 tests so far. One of those tests was the test of fame, and he passed that test. He didn't attribute the fame to himself, and yet like the way of many of the mashayikh, the more they try to hide, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals them, because they have to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's religion. But now there's an even greater test. And that is that his whole life is about to turn around. He had a career path in front of him. He had wealth and fame, right, around the corner. All he had to do was continue his studies with the sahir, remain in the court of the king, and he could have been the most powerful man after the king in the empire. But the boy chose a different direction. He chose the direction of truth, the path of truth. And as a result now, he's going from one extreme to the other extreme, but now his life is in danger. The king threatens his advisor and says that if you do not turn back and you retract your faith, right, or recant, I essentially will kill you in a very gruesome fashion. And he says, no, my Lord is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my Lord is Allah, I will not retract. And so the king calls for a giant saw to be brought, and he lays this man in front of the people in his court, and he has him sawed in half. I mean, that's a very... May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from such trials. I mean, that must be such a traumatic scene, to see a person to be executed in that fashion. And the rahib is there witnessing this, and the next threat is directed to him. The rahib, the hermit, is then threatened by the king, and the king says to him that if you do not retract publicly that you believe in a God other than myself, or a Lord other than myself, then that the same fate awaits you. And he also doesn't retract. He remains firm on his faith. Right? He remains persistent on his iman. And as a result, the same thing happens to him, and the boy is watching. Now obviously this is an extraordinary story, right? If any of us was in that situation, we'd be calling the shaykh, like, shaykh, in this situation, can I say that I'm not a believer? Right? What's the fatwa here? The fatwa is obviously that in the case of life and death, even though it's more beloved to give your life, right? It's more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give your life. In that situation, you can say whatever you need to say to get out of that situation if your belief in the heart is sound. But imagine a young boy being traumatized in this fashion. What strength of faith Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to him, that at that point when the king then directs the threat to the boy and says, it's your turn. You also publicly declare your retraction. Otherwise, the same fate awaits you. And he says, you have no power to kill me. You have no power to harm me or to help me. Indeed, the power resides only in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This again infuriates the king. He calls some soldiers to himself. He says, take this boy, take him to the top of a mountain. They used to do this as a form of punishment because it was a public execution, right? To see someone flung from the top of a mountain or from the top of a high place, this was a way of basically, disgracing that person, but also in public. So he tells his soldiers, take this young boy to the top of a mountain and fling him from the top of that mountain. And so when the child is brought to this place where he's about to be executed, I want you to reflect on what he says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what his dua was. Such was his faith that he didn't say, oh Allah, destroy these people. Oh Allah, fling them off the mountain. Oh Allah, cause the earth to swallow them up. He simply says, Allahumma kfinihim bima shi'ta. Allahumma kfinihim bima shi'ta. Essentially, in layman's terms, oh Allah, take care of them the way that you see fit. Oh Allah, be sufficient for me in regards to them the way that you see fit. Oh Allah, take care of the situation. He didn't say specifically, oh Allah, I want this to happen, I want this to happen. He just said essentially, oh Allah, be kafi, oh Allah, suffice me. And that's a faith right there, right? And as each test is, he's going through each test in his life, his faith is only increasing to the point that he makes this dua that, and the mashayikh tell us that when you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a way that you're demanding from Him. Oh Allah, I want this, and I want it this way, and I want it in this time. Oh Allah, I want this job, make it happen. No, you should ask, oh Allah, whatever you're content with, whatever you think is best for me, allow that to happen. Meaning you have to give up your desires to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you ask Him. A lot of people, they complain, they say, I've been asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I've been doing this, and I've been doing that. Why isn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responding? And there could be many reasons, right? One of the reasons is because we don't ask properly. I once asked an elderly individual in our community, was having a difficulty, personal problem. This was quite young. I was in high school at the time. And every time I would meet him, I would ask him, like, how do I get out of this situation? This was actually one of the first tests. I was coming towards the faith. I was excited about religion. But like essentially my family was insisting that I take a certain career path. And they were resistant, very hesitant about my engagement in the masjid and the community activities and things like that. So I felt very trapped. I was young. I felt very trapped. It was very little issues, and that wasn't a major issue. But I remember every time I would meet this individual, he would ask me, like, how are things at home? And I would say, it's not working. My du'a's not working. So I remember then once I gave him the same response. He said, so how many nights did you wake up for tahajjud and pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Like he was asking me, like honestly, so you did do that, right? I said, I don't think I ever did that. I hadn't wake up in the middle of the night. And he says, then what did you do? How are you asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you didn't wake up at the time where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers du'as, the time of istijab al-da'wat? You didn't even wake up at that time and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what do you expect? And then it really hit me that, there's a difference between like asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala correctly. I mean, you have to prove to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I really want this to happen. That's why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he recommended that you weep when you cry, or you attempt to. Why? To show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I really want this. So in any case, the faith of this boy is such that he says simply, Allahumma kfinihim bima shi'ta. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts that dua. Can you imagine the sincerity of the dua of this person, of this child, that, obviously his life is in danger, and he's gone through test after test, he's passed those trials. And he makes this very simple dua, oh Allah, just be sufficient for me. So it said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused the earth to shake, and as a result of that earthquake, those guards that were sent to kill the boy fell off the mountain and died themselves. And what did the boy do? You would imagine this is a chance. Run away, right? Migrate to another land. Do something, but just get away from that situation. He walked straight back to the palace of the king. He walked into the palace and he presented himself. And the king is looking at him and said, what happened to my guards? He said, Kafani Allah. Allah was sufficient for me. Allah took care of them. Allah took care of me, Allah took care of them. I mean, that's subhanAllah, where do you get that degree of strength of heart? That comes from what? Gradual, accustomization to trauma. And a willingness to use that as an opportunity to grow and develop as a person. So he walks straight back into the palace of the king and he presents himself. The king then orders some more soldiers to come and he says, now take him to the ocean. Take him onto a boat and drown him, right? The earth can't swallow you up there. So they do that. They comply with the orders of the king. They take the boy to the middle of the ocean, or they take him to the ocean, and they attempt to drown him essentially, or throw him into the ocean. But before they do so, he makes the same dua, Allahumma kfinihim bima shi'ta, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts the dua. It said the boat overturns, all of the soldiers are killed, and the boy walks back. In one narration, Ibn Ishaq mentions he walks on water straight back to the palace of the king. You're probably thinking, what is the boy thinking? What's wrong with him? What's wrong with him is that he has absolute conviction that nothing can happen except by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He knows that he has a purpose in life. He knew through perhaps inspiration that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted from him, that he sent a message to the king and his people. And so he walked straight back. He completed his mission. This time, the king obviously is sort of shaken in his faith. You can imagine that he used to believe that he was the most powerful entity that existed. And he recognizes that no matter what he's doing, it's not his hukum, his amr is not being fulfilled. So the boy says to the king, he says, look, you will not be able to kill me, except if you comply with my directions, my instructions. So he says, what are those instructions? He says, you must tie me to a date palm tree, or to a tree, and you must collect the citizens of your nation. And then you must take an arrow from my quiver and shoot me with that arrow. But while you shoot me, you shoot that arrow, you have to say, Bismillahi Rabbi hadha al-ghulam. in the name of Allah, the Lord of this boy. I mean, you must publicly declare this. That is the only way you will rid yourself of me. You see, the iman of the emperor is kind of sort of shaken, right? I mean, he actually complies. He actually believes that this is the only way now that he's going to be able to rid himself of this nuisance. Quote unquote nuisance, right? So he takes the boy, he orders him to be tied up to a tree. He orders all the people to congregate and to witness this execution. And before he then flings the arrow or shoots the arrow, with the arrow of the boy himself, he says loudly, Bismillahi Rabbi hadha al-ghulam. In the name of Allah, the Lord of this boy. And he shoots the arrow, the boy dies. And now the emperor thought that I've finally rid myself of this nuisance, of this problem. Now I can continue the way that the world was before this person, go back to the good old days, right? But what happened as a result of the sacrifice of this young boy? That the entire congregation, the entire body of individuals who were present at that time, they see the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They witness the excuse me. They witness the defiance of this boy and his conviction on the truth, and it shakes them. It shakes them to the core. And they all testify there that we also believe in the Lord of that boy. And they bring their iman on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and now the king has an even greater problem. That all the people that were present on that day, they are now testifying that there is no God worthy of worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that is the background of the story of Qutila Ashab al-Ukhdud, An-Nari Dhat al-Waqud, that because of the struggles and the sacrifice, the resilience of this one boy, an entire nation brings their faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then it's mentioned in the hadith that one by one, the citizens of the nation are brought, told to retract their faith, or to give up their faith, and one by one they're flung into the fire. To the extent that a young woman, a mother, is brought, and she has her child in her lap, or in her arms. And she's obviously extremely anxious and fearful, right, for herself and for her child. And so miraculously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes the child to give comfort to the infant, the sabi, the infant, to give comfort to her mother, or to his mother, by saying, Ya umma isbiri fa innaki ala al-haq. Oh my mother, be patient, for verily you are on the truth. Can you imagine? I mean, she's concerned about the protection of her own child. But the child, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the child as a means of giving her comfort. That you're on the truth, don't worry. Be patient, for verily you are on the truth. And that's what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was referring to. What's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to in the Quran. It's beautiful. I mean, the Quran, we tell stories not just because it's entertaining or edutainment, right? Allah, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ أَحْسَنَ الْقَصَصِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the best of stories so that we may derive lessons. And what lessons do we learn from the life of the beloved messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Other than that, what? If you are going to accept Islam, you're going to believe that this is your faith, then your reality in this world is that you're going to have to struggle and sacrifice. And that's fine, that's okay. In fact, I remember when I was first learning about Islam, I met a scholar. And so I didn't know much about my name, Bilal. And so I was asking him, I was reading up a little on the history of Bilal radiallahu anhu. So I remember I asked the scholar a question. I said, Sheikh, Mawlana, I learned somewhere that if a person's life is in danger, that they can basically, say that they're a disbeliever. They can use words of shirk to get out of that situation, right? Isn't that what the ruling is in Islam? And so he said, yes, that's true. I said, then why did Bilal radiallahu anhu say that, okay, I believe in whatever you believe, and why did he undergo so much suffering and torture and still say ahad, 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 right? Knowing that ahad was actually what was, upsetting and infuriating his torturers. Why would he do that? So he said, subhanallah, what was the sunnah, what was Islam to Bilal radiallahu anhu? He asked me a question. He said, what was Islam to Bilal radiallahu anhu? I didn't understand where he was going with that. So I said, I don't know. I mean, Islam was whatever, the Prophet ﷺ taught him. He says, Islam to Bilal radiallahu anhu, because at that time, what was Islam? It was La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Salah wasn't an obligation yet. Zakat wasn't an obligation yet. There was no Hajj yet. That was an obligation. What Islam was what? The example of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what is Bilal radiallahu anhu observing every day of his life? That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is being tortured. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is undergoing struggles and sacrifices every day of his life. That is Islam to him. So why was he not averse to difficulty and struggles and sacrifice? Because that was ittiba' al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That was following his Prophet. I mean, it would have been almost like cowardice for the Sahaba radiallahu anhum to absolve themselves of difficulty when their beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam every day was being tortured in this manner. So for Bilal radiallahu anhu, this was not a question of fiqh. This was a question of love for the beloved Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that really struck me. I said, I didn't think about it that way. I was thinking about it from a legal perspective, a fiqh perspective. What's permissible, what's not permissible. But sometimes we have to look at قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِ يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهِ. We want the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like the boy had the divine support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes what that means is that فَاتَّبِعُونِ يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهِ. We have to follow step by step the example of the beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if we do that, then the divine help, يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهِ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love us. And after that, what else do you need? The love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient. If we have Allah on our side, Allah will be sufficient for us. All you have to say is, Allahumma kfinihim bima shi'ta. Allahumma anta al-kafi. Fakfini, right? Be sufficient for me. Be kafi. And Allah will take care. I mean, there was a time, I just give you a personal example in my life where, there were a lot of difficulties. I was trying to carve out a new career path, the path of knowledge. I know this was a certain time in the early 2000s and late 90s. Dr. Rania's husband, Sheikh Rami, and I, we like to think about those days when it was very odd for someone to go and study Islam at that time, to kind of divert from the traditional path of engineering and medicine. We didn't know what was out there. We didn't know what was our future because there were no examples really. There were very few examples of scholars who were indigenous, grew up here, were born here. And I went through a lot of difficulties, and I remember one of the people who advised me during that time, he said, what you have to do essentially is this: accept that your path is going to be a path of difficulty. Accept that your life is going to be a life of difficulty. Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min. The world is what? It's a prison for the believer. That's just the nature of this world. We understand that. It's part of our civilizational code. And so, embrace it when it comes your way. Don't invite it, but embrace it when it comes your way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make you such that wherever you need to serve the deen, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in China, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in difficulty or in ease, you'll be able to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's religion. I asked him, and we were traveling from masjid to masjid for some period of time in the mountains of Pakistan and the deserts of Pakistan, and I asked one of my advisors, I said, man, it's getting really difficult. I was sick for about 2.5 months. I remember I had stomach issues. And I got so physically weak. I'm already so weak. I was so physically weak that I could barely walk at some point. And so I used to not use a sleeping bag. I used to use a very thin sheet. And I got to a point where I could almost not take it anymore. I needed a more cushioned sleeping bag. So I asked one of my advisors, Mawlana Faraz, I asked him, Mawlana, what do you think if I actually get a better, more comfortable sleeping bag? And you know what he said? He said, that's fine. Just remember that one day you'll be sleeping 6 feet under, on the ground. So remember that that's going to be your bed for a long time. Get used to it now. Not for your whole life, but while you're on this journey of da'wah, get accustomed to that. That will make you a better person. And I remember I did that. And I spent 4 months of my life just living with the amount of stuff you can carry in a small bag. 2 pairs of clothing in the bag, 1 pair of clothing on my back, a pillow that was basically a piece of styrofoam and a small sheet to sleep on and a sheet on myself, toothbrush, toothpaste, and essentially all the other basic necessities, a small knife. And I lived like that for 4 months. And I can tell you that that was the most formative period of my life. So sometimes we have to develop resilience and develop stamina, especially for American-born children, that we just don't have those experiences oftentimes. We have to be willing to embrace those and understand that they make us better people. When I was in high school, I remember there was a friend of mine, he was really into Bruce Lee. And so he convinced me to join the gymnastics team. I thought gymnastics was all like, soft stuff, like football was cool. But actually, I found out the gymnasts were like the strongest people in the school, and they used to, like, mashallah, they had like a kind of a club mentality. They took care of each other. So I joined the team. So this guy used to tell me about Bruce Lee all the time. So he said, you know what Bruce Lee does to get himself? He used to do weird stuff. He used to ask me, punch me really hard in my shoulder. So I asked, I'd be like, why? He's like, I need to get my muscles trained, right? So he said, I was watching this documentary about Bruce Lee, and he used to electrocute himself. I don't know if this is true, but he said that he used to electrocute himself a little. Why? Because the trauma that would cause the muscles to harden up, right? And that's oftentimes in martial arts they do this. A lot of the training, when you hit your bone against, or you traumatize your bone very hard, it becomes quite hard, right? It calcifies or something like that. And so essentially what happens is that as a result of this constant small degree of trauma, it causes the person to become quite tough. So he would always ask us to toughen him up by, like punching him in the arm and stuff like that, right? Because I want to make his muscles tough. I sometimes think that, as a concept, and we understand that concept in medicine, vaccines are essentially like that. We expose ourselves to a small amount of trauma so that when a great amount of trauma occurs in our life, we're able to face that. I think that's a very powerful tool. As a community, we experience different types of trauma. If we expose ourselves to that trauma, sometimes it's not like you have to face it yourself, but you actually go and you sit in the company of people who are dealing with that type of trauma. You join organizations that do relief work, visit refugee camps, go to the inner city and go to places, not just give zakat online, right? But go to a family that actually deserves zakat and sit with them and experience their life for a moment. Sit with somebody who tells you that every day of my life I'm tempted to go on the street and sell guns because that was my old life. If it wasn't for the zakat you just gave me, I think tomorrow I was about to go and meet my old friends. I don't care if I have to go back to jail. I can't live like this. My children are starving, I'm living in this dhillah, disgrace. If you can, expose yourself to the trauma of others, it builds your own ability, your stamina. And as Imam Ghazali, and I'm going to repeat this advice of Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh, if you read on a regular basis the stories of those people who are examples for us, success stories in this world and in the hereafter, then insha'Allah ta'ala we will create this culture of resilience in our homes, where people will look at these things and say, yes, insha'Allah, I'll be able to take care of it. Right? What does the Mutanabbi say? على قدر أهل العزم تأتي العزائم وتأتي على قدر الكرام المكارم تعظم في عين الصغير صغارها وتسخر في عين العظيم العظائم. He says the people of resolve, على قدر أهل العزم تأتي العزائم. According to the people of resolve come resolutions. And according to the people of nobility spreads nobility and good character. The people تسخر في تعظم في عين الصغير صغارها. People who have small hearts and small ambitions, everything seems great to them. Everything seems so significant. تعظم في عين الصغير صغارها. Small things seem so, عظيم, grand to them. وتسخر في عين العظيم العظائم. But in the eyes of a grand or a great person, big things seem very small. Where do you get that perspective? It comes from a willingness to undergo mujahada, struggle and sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq and give us the stability. We don't, by the way, just as like a warning, we don't invite trauma, right? We don't want trauma in our lives. But that's just the reality of the world that we live in. That's our existence. And if we come across a situation where we sometimes have to even invite it, that's by like the guidance of someone who says, maybe you should pray a little more, hurt your nafs by fasting when you don't want to fast. But normally we don't invite trauma in our lives. But we embrace it when it comes, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala oftentimes makes it a means of great benefit and the elevation of our faith. I'll finish with just a personal story. That when I saw my mother, she, rahimallah, passed away of cancer, there was a 1 year of her life where I saw many things, life lessons. At a point where the pain became so severe that they were about to put her on morphine. I remember she would complain, she would say that, you don't understand the pain that I'm feeling right now. And obviously we couldn't sympathize with that pain. And she described it once. She said, imagine that you are being stabbed, right? How much pain would you feel if you're stabbed? Imagine that 24 hours of your life now. Every single moment you're feeling like that. That pain is not going away, and you know it's going to be there forever. And she would sometimes say that, I don't know if I can handle this. Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know how much I'm going to be able to handle? It's too much. And I would be afraid. Like, what if she gets to the point that she begins to complain about her pain? How is that going to affect her faith? She passed away on the 25th night of Ramadan. In those nights of Ramadan, every day at Maghrib Salah, after during the iftar time, she would make a dua. And I can testify, I'm not exaggerating, that the sincerity of her du'as, I've never heard a dua recited like that, even from the great mashayikh. And I've heard the du'as of the great mashayikh. And she would be reciting these, she would be asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with such power, with such sincerity. And it was as if she was using the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but in Urdu. And I was just so moved by that. And I thought, I know that Allah may not ever test me with such a difficulty with cancer, because I don't have the ability to handle it like she does. And it wouldn't be necessarily a means of elevating my faith. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He tests you with something, know that He has given you the ability to overcome it. If He had not given you the ability to overcome that test, He would not have given you that test. Because Allah does not, impose upon a person a burden they cannot bear. So what does that say about people who survive through these difficulties? Survive in the sense of faith. That their faith doesn't just maintain itself, but it increases because of difficulties. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made these people great people. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to test us, right, in any way that tests our faith. But that whenever we come across a test in this life, that it becomes a means of the elevation of our faith and our iman in this life, and the elevation of our position in the akhirah. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Subhanallah bihamdihi. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.